Hey Hope City, it's Phil here, back with some more from Joshua as we look into our series, Returning to Mission. Last week, just as a quick recap, we looked at chapter 4 and we talked about the significance of these 12 stones, right? And the significance of the 12 stones is this idea or this theme of recollection. It's about remembering that it is God who has brought us through, and it's remembering what He has brought us through. And then today in chapter 5, what we're looking at, what we're going to be talking about is actually preparation, okay? And so for the people of Israel, they are preparing to enter the promised land. And this meant, in terms of preparation, this meant that God was going to remove from them the stigma of their disobedience, the stigma of their disbelief, which resulted in them wandering in the desert for 40 years, unable to enter into the promised land. And so chapter 5 is about preparation. It's about the type of preparation that renews our identity and our calling through a radical act of obedience. The chapter that we're looking into today, it really starts by telling us that now, at this precise moment, would be the perfect time to strike for the people of Israel. The perfect time to channel all the momentum that they've kind of gotten through crossing the Jordan on dry ground into a coordinated attack on Jericho. Now, I've never fought in any wars, and I'm really bad at paintball. You don't want me on your team. But even I know that now, this is the perfect time to strike. And how do I know this? Well, one, I think the people are full of confidence in God at this moment. I mean, imagine crossing the Jordan River on dry ground. Imagine if you were one of the Israelites. Because if I were one of the Israelites, I would be saying to the guy next to me, right? Like, man, did you just see that? Right? Like, my sandals are completely dry. Where's Jericho? Well, let's go right now. Like, we don't need guns. We don't need cannons. We don't need tanks. We don't need drones. God's got this. We can do this right now. If we just track the emotional intensity and the emotional journey of the people of God, they are probably full of confidence in God right now. The second thing that kind of pops out to me and tells me that this would be the perfect time for them to strike is that their enemies at this point have lost all confidence in themselves, right? Verse 1 of this passage tells us that after they got word, or after the word got out about how the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground, their enemies essentially lost all courage to fight them. Scripture tells us, that their hearts melted in fear and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites, right? This is the perfect time for the Israelites to strike, perfect time for them to attack, because they are now full of confidence in God and their enemies have lost all confidence in themselves. So from a human point of view, where we find the Israelites in chapter 5, this is the perfect time to attack. But it's in this exact moment, at this moment where the people are full of confidence in God and their enemies are full of fear, that God actually says to Joshua, wait a second, I want you to cripple all the men. I don't know if you realize how crazy this sounds. And it's not just because we're talking about circumcision here, but from a merely strategic standpoint. Because if I were Joshua and God told me, if I were leading the people of Israel and God told me that right after crossing the Jordan, right before we head into our very first battle, that I was to issue an order that we were to circumcise all the men, I'm going to be honest with you, I'd probably push back. Like, all my leadership and strategic instinct would push back against this. I would say something to God like this. Okay, I hear you, but how about you let us take Jericho first, right? And because all the guys got to fight, and then afterwards we'll do this, right? Afterwards we'll get the flint knives out, right? Like, after the first battle, let us get that first battle done first. Or maybe I would push back with something like this. Okay, Lord, but are you sure this is a good idea? I mean, we just crossed the Jordan River. I don't even know where the nearest hospital is. We have no doctors. We're kind of low on medical supplies, and which we might need if we're going to go into war. And what if something goes wrong? I mean, like, we don't even have enough bandages for the procedure, never mind for war. I mean, what if our guys don't heal in time, and the guys from Jericho hear about this, and they come and attack us while we're vulnerable, while we're still resting up and while we're recuperating? Are you sure this is a good idea? And God says to Joshua, do it. You just need to go and do this. And here's what I think the scriptures are trying to tell us. And here's what I think the people of Israel and their journey and their history and their journey with God is trying to tell us. It's that our victory in life and our victory in mission is not accomplished by our human strategy or our human wisdom, but it's accomplished simply by our obedience to what God has said. Even when it sounds ridiculous or even stupid or contrary to human wisdom. Our victory in life, our victory in mission, as we're talking about a church returning to mission, it's not accomplished based on our human strategy or our human wisdom, but it's by our obedience to what God has said. You see, the first thing that I want us to come around and understand is that circumcision is an act of obedience. God is saying to his people, I'm going to mark you so that it is clear to you that you have a relationship to me. We are marked by our relationship to God through none other than our obedience to him. You see, of all the marks in the world, and especially if you're a man, you might be thinking what I'm thinking. You might be thinking, God, I love you. I want to be in a relationship with you, but isn't there another way? I mean, like a tattoo might suffice or be nice, an earring maybe. But as a grown man, right? We're not talking about if we just came out of the womb and the doctor just kind of does a snip and all of this happens while we're unaware. We're talking about doing this as a grown man with no anesthesia, no nurses, just another dude with a flint knife. I mean, you gotta have some sort of real dedication to go through with this. I mean, you're into this. I mean, you're committed to this relationship when you go through something like this, right? Circumcision is an act of obedience. This is an act of loyalty. There's no greater test of loyalty or obedience. Like, circumcision simply is an act of obedience. But more than that, you see, for Joshua and the people of Israel, circumcision is not just symbolic of their obedience to God. Circumcision is symbolic of their complete dependence upon God. Let me kind of explain what I mean here. And to know why, God would choose this mark of circumcision, we need to go all the way back to Abraham. Because when we go back to Abraham, we see that circumcision is actually symbolic. It's an act of utter dependence. You see, God is saying to his people, I'm going to mark you in such a way that you will know that I will do for you what I've promised to do for you. You see, we are marked by his promise that he's going to do for us what we can't do on our own for ourselves. We are marked by our dependence upon him. Just a quick overview of Abraham's journey with God, which begins in Genesis 12. And in Genesis 12, God promises that he will make Abraham into a great nation, that he will bless him, that he will make his name great, that he will bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. Basically, God is saying to Abraham, I've got your back because I'm going to rescue the entire world through you and your people. You see, God's promise is personal. He's saying, I will bless you. I will make you into a great nation. But it's not just personal, it's also expansive. I am blessing you so that you will bless everyone on earth. See, this expansive nature of God's promise and of God's blessing, it hinges on this very personal blessing of multiplication. We're talking about family planning, we're talking about succession planning, we're basically talking about children and family and heirs. And the problem with this is that when God calls Abraham, Abraham is already 75 years old. And we find out that him and Sarah, they haven't had any children yet. They were probably married when they were young, and they probably tried for decades. They probably tried everything under the sun. And it probably became clear to them that this hope of theirs, this dream of theirs, this heart-yearning ache of theirs wasn't going to happen. You see, for Abraham and Sarah, the strangest thing is that they had succeeded and flourished in every single aspect of life. They had amassed tremendous wealth and power and influence, and they were known, they had a good name among the people. But they had no heir. And this was probably a source of sorrow and struggle and maybe even conflict for them. So for Abraham and Sarah, having a child and then having a lineage which then becomes a nation would be this miraculous act of God, even at the age of 75. God makes this promise, right? And it's not like 9 months later, all of a sudden they're pregnant. Because get this, the covenant of circumcision isn't really given to Abraham until he's 99. So for 24 years, God has been taking Abraham on this journey, promising him that he's going to make him into a great nation. And for all of those 24 years after the promise is made, Abraham and Sarah still haven't been able to conceive. And if we want to understand the circumstances that arise, the circumstances out of which circumcision arises for Abraham and for the people of Israel, we need to understand that the story that's given right before. And the story is that in Genesis 16, actually, Abraham is now 86 years old, and him and Sarah still haven't been able to have a child, and never mind anything that resembles a nation. And so Abraham and Sarah, and we need to pay attention to this, they decide to take matters into their own hands. They decide to take matters into their own hands. And Sarah tells Abraham to sleep with her maidservant Hagar, and he does. And then the child Ishmael is born. But this is not what God had in mind when he promised that he would build a family and a nation through Abraham and Sarah to bless all the peoples of the earth. And so it's in chapter 17 that God gives Abraham the covenant of circumcision. It's almost like it's in response to all that has happened. It's in response to Abraham and Sarah taking matters into their own hands. In chapter 17, God meets with Abraham. He confirms his covenant with him, basically reminding Abraham that he hasn't forgotten about him. And believe me, if I were Abraham, I would need that reminder too. Imagine walking with God for 24 years after a promise has been made and seeing no sign of that happening, nothing encouraging that seems to lead us to believe that God will come through for us. And then in chapter 17, God meets with Abraham and he confirms his covenant with him. He basically reminds him that he hasn't forgotten about him. And he reminds him that the call that he gave him is still valid, it's still true. You see, God is not randomly choosing a sign for Abraham. It's not like, should I show Abraham this secret handshake that he's going to pass on to all the other males in the household? Or should I give him circumcision? I think I'm just going to give him circumcision. This isn't a random thing that is happening. You see, the sign of circumcision, the reason why God cuts where he cuts is given in the context of Abraham's failure to have children with Sarah. It's given within the context of Abraham's attempt to take matters into his own hands and having a child through Hagar. You see, circumcision was symbolic of the renewal of a radical trust in God in the face of incredible odds. It's the kind of trust that one would yield our powers of procreation and of building a family to God and saying, take this. I can't do it, but I trust that you can. You see, circumcision is symbolic for Abraham saying to God, I am being completely, totally dependent upon you. If I have descendants that become a great nation for your purposes to bless the whole world, it will be your doing and not mine. That's the backstory for circumcision. Circumcision is about God saving the world through his work in Abraham and his family. It's about trusting that God will do the things that he has promised to do in his time, in his way, just as he promised, though it might not happen as we envision or even as we try to control. And in Genesis 17, we also read God saying that the sign of circumcision is not just for Abram, but it's for all of his descendants. And now we need to look at Joshua in this passage and the people of Israel, because in this passage we find out that while they were in the wilderness, an entire generation had not been circumcised. They had wandered for 40 years because they had refused to believe that God would fight for them and give them the promised land. They lost their focus on God when they saw how big the people were and how tall the walls to their city were. And they lost their nerve, they lost their trust in God. And so because of their disobedience, because of their disbelief, the sign of God's covenant with them was suspended. And Moses at no point issued a call to circumcise any of those who were born after those who had escaped Egypt. You know, these people were literally and physically marked by their disobedience and their disbelief until this moment with Joshua right now. Until the very moment where, from a human perspective, it looked like this would be the perfect time to strike. And maybe even they started to believe that maybe they can do this on their own now. Maybe they could take this opportunity to take things into their own hands again, because they've come so far. They've crossed the Jordan. But God had other things in mind. He wanted to take away the stigma of disobedience and disbelief. He wanted to renew his covenant with his people, with this particular generation. And he wanted their journey into the promised land to be marked by obedience and trust, not by disobedience and disbelief. He wanted their relationship with him as he gave them the promised land to be characterized by obedience to him and utter dependence upon him. I don't know if this is speaking to you today, but it's speaking to me. Because as we think about returning to mission as a church, God is primarily calling us to practice two things that shape our identity and our calling as his people. He is calling us to first and foremost be a people who are all about obeying him. I mean, when we talk about returning to mission, it is easy for us to get caught up in our ideas and our plans and our strategies and all the things that we want to do for him. But God is simply asking us to obey him. He's asking us to listen for his voice, and then to respond in obedience once we hear his voice. He's asking us to obey him. And the second thing he's asking us to do is to depend upon him. He is not looking for us to depend upon our talents, our gifts, our resources, or anything we have going for us as individuals or as a family or us as a church. He is asking us to trust that whatever he's called us to do, he will do through us and for us. He will come through. We just need to depend on him. And so the questions that we have for microchurch as we break and go off into our microchurch for sharing and discussion, a couple questions, 4 questions I'd like for us to kind of discuss in our microchurches. The first is just an icebreaker. Share a time when you were stretched to depend upon God. You know, share with your microchurch one time that you were stretched to depend upon God. Second question is this: what is God calling you to do in obedience to Him right now? In life or in mission? Third question: how is God stretching you to depend on Him right now? How is God stretching you, calling you, challenging you to depend on Him right now? This can be in life, this can be in mission. And a fourth thing is this: how can your microchurch support you, encourage you as you step forward in obedience and dependence on God? We can't do this alone. We need one another. Okay? Have a great time discussing in microchurch. I will see you guys next week.